Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The United States has 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of its prison population. Why, in heaven's name, is that the case? Why is our prison system so often so barbaric? Why isn't it more humane? And why is such an enormous percentage of America's prisoners comprised of African Americans? The data seem to holler that we're doing a lot that is very wrong. We'll discuss all of this and more with my guest, Glenn E. Martin, a former top executive with the Fortune Society and the founder of the prison reform advocacy group, JustLeadershipUSA. Glenn, great to see you. Thanks for being here. You know, sometimes it seems like the United States is trying to lock up everybody in sight. In New York City, where we are now, you can get hauled in for like some of the most minor offenses. Why does the United States lock up so many of its people?
You know, when people hear that we have 2.3 million people in prison, that figure tends to give them reason to pause. But it's even worse. 65 million Americans have a criminal record on file. And in addition to the 2.3 million in prison, we have another 5.6 million under criminal justice supervision, parole, probation, GPS. So it's an even larger number of Americans who are now caught up in the footprint of our correctional system. And I think a big part of it is that we've abandoned the values that we say we hold near and dear as Americans when it comes to our criminal justice system. And the only value left is punishment. So we've gotten rid of proportionality and parsimony and social justice and the room for redemption. And instead have decided to criminalize poverty and criminalize lack of access to health care and jobs and housing and so on.
Was this just sort of a slow creep? Because, you know, when I was a youngster, it was not nearly this bad. Is it just something we didn't pay enough attention to and it just got gradually worse and worse?
You know, you have to ask yourself, is there a correlation between the ending of the civil rights era, if you will, and then the spike in incarceration rates in the United States? So what you have is mass incarceration really has only existed for the past 4.5 decades or so, beginning in the late 60s, early 70s. And not only do you have this huge spike in incarceration, but if you extrapolate the data, it's mostly men of color. Here in the United States. And then if you add on what we call collateral consequences or invisible punishment, the fact that once you have a criminal record, you lose many of the rights that we hold near and dear as Americans, the right to get certain types of jobs and housing and education and so on. And then you think of the civil rights era where we fought for what I call the 4 E's: education, employment, enfranchisement, equality, and all of those things have been eviscerated for so many Americans through involvement in the criminal justice system.
Now, you grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, I believe, and you were actually imprisoned yourself. Tell us your story.
So I grew up single-parent household on public assistance in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, at a time when it was a really tough neighborhood. In fact, they called it Bed-Stuy, do or die. And, you know, there were many things in the streets that really pulled us away from the family, unfortunately. And I found myself incarcerated here in New York, serving 6 years for a robbery conviction. But as soon as I got into the system, I saw the hypocrisy that was built into the system. But you know what I also saw? I saw that we lock up some of America's best and brightest. I met so many men while I was serving time in prison who didn't fit the narrative that America gives us about who we incarcerate in this country. I saw many men who were there with crimes so much less serious than the one I went to prison for, who were doing 3-4 times the amount of time I was going to serve in prison, many of them for drugs. And, you know, I lived in New York through the crack epidemic. And, you know, when you think of what people do in these communities to try to survive and to try to be successful, crack cocaine was it for a really long time. And a lot of people at very young ages in their lives, 16, 17, 18, started selling crack or using. And they found themselves under New York State's notorious Rockefeller drug laws, locked up for really long stretches of time. And for me, having earned a 2-year liberal arts degree while I was in prison, something that rarely exists any longer since Congress took away Pell Grants many years ago, I felt as though, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. And I just couldn't walk away from what I saw in the prison system and not do something about it.
So you've actually said that when you left prison, you saw that period of time as a rebirth. What did you mean by that?
So, I went to prison with a narrative in my own head that I grew up with in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, that allowed me to survive, right? It was about how people of color are treated in this country. It was about slavery. It was about Jim Crow. It was about all the justification I needed as a person to engage in the behavior that I did. And then I went to prison, and a correction counselor said to me, he said, "You should go to college." He looked at my grades, and no one had ever said that to me before, not even in college, in high school, before I went to prison, and sent me to a prison 10 hours away from home where there happened to be a college program, a very small college program that was privately funded. And I remember watching a film on the Holocaust, and at one point in the film, a piece of bulldozer equipment pulls up to dead human bodies stacked about 6 high and shovels them into a mass grave. And I just remember that being a moment that challenged the narrative that I grew up with and helped me understand that human beings have so much more in common rather than the differences that we have. And that was a slight opening for me that I just kept opening wider and wider. And we know education does this for everyone, not just for people involved in the criminal justice system. So coming out of the system, I saw it as an opportunity to take the skills that I already had, the education I gained, and to do something different with it. And I started facing all the barriers everyone else faced. I visited about 50 employers here in New York City. Almost every single one turned me down immediately because of the felony conviction. And the one or two that offered me the job, hours later they called back and rescinded the offer, usually because by the time it gets to HR, the HR department says, no way, even if the person who interviewed you was interested. And then in New York, for instance, you get your voting rights back when you get off parole. I remember getting off parole and being so excited about getting re-involved in being a citizen and being part of decision-making, and having the Board of Election here in New York State tell me I couldn't vote, even though the law clearly said I could. But they, through misinformation, was further disenfranchising me. And we have 5.8 million Americans who are disenfranchised based on having a felony record who can't vote. And then I would argue that there are millions more who are disenfranchised just based on lack of knowledge about what the laws are from state to state.
Now, you mentioned the loss of Pell Grants, which make it more difficult for inmates to get any kind of college education. Beyond just the educational aspects, what's daily life like in prison for people? What does it do to people?
Yeah, it's torturous. It's torturous because you enter a system that's called a correctional system, and so you go there looking for that. You go there looking for an opportunity. By the time you get to state prison, you have a sense of how much time you're going to do, and you become, for most people, resolute to do something to change your life. And then you find out that for most people, the best you can hope for is a job as a porter, cleaning up the housing unit day after day after day, watching television day after day after day, maybe going to the yard and working out. And the best part of it becomes the fellowship and the camaraderie, the other men there, particularly the older men who are serving time, who help teach the younger folks, like literally educate you. I mean, me having the chance to go to college didn't only mean that there was an investment made in me to keep me out of the system, but I can't tell you, I tutored countless number of other people in prison to help them get their lives together. But for the most part, it sends a message, particularly to young people, because we lock up so many young people these days, about how America feels about them, right? At a time in their lives when they should be out there establishing their identity, figuring out who they are, figuring out where they fit into society, we're sending them a strong message that we're willing to throw them away. We're in a society where we're trying to recycle everything except human beings, it seems like.
But there is also another side to prison life, a brutal side to prison life. For folks on the outside looking at this and trying to be good citizens, how should we view that? What should we take away from it, and what's our obligation to either change it or accept it or whatever?
I think the biggest solution to the violence that we see in prison is light, and more light. I think that our prisons are not very transparent at all, and most people don't know what happens in prison. And the examples that you're referring to are the exception and not the rule. If prison were as violent as we see on television, a guy like me wouldn't have been able to survive. I mean, there were guys there much bigger than I. And yes, there was violence. I mean, I saw some violence that I'd never seen in the community, and I grew up in a pretty tough neighborhood. At the same time, what I saw more of were people trying to turn their lives around and people sort of reckoning with how they ended up in the system. And you have to ask yourself, why do these moments of extreme violence happen in the system? It's because it is a system that's a pressure cooker. I mean, when I went there, the system was double and triple bunked. I mean, essentially the system was over 50% over capacity at the time when I was there. And so can you imagine you're in a cell block that's meant to hold 50 people, and yet there's 120 people in that cell block. And, you know, that sort of pressure and the trauma that comes with that would cause almost any human being to explode. And I remember so many situations where the older men in prison, again, would talk to the younger folks about the importance of keeping themselves busy, staying out of trouble, staying away from drugs and gangs and the sort of things that get you in trouble in prison. But that was the exception. The violence that I saw in prison, I was there for 6 years. I think I saw 3 sort of very violent incidents in the entire 6 years.
Your organization is called JustLeadershipUSA. Before that, as I mentioned, you had been with the Fortune Society. So I want you to explain what Just Leadership does and hopes to achieve, but also explain how you became an advocate in the first place.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the second part first.
Sure.
Actually, when I came out, I'll tell you, I couldn't find a job. I went to an organization like the Fortune Society, a reentry organization, and got placed in a public interest law firm here in New York called the Legal Action Center, literally answering the phones at the front desk, making $17,000 a year, and owing the state of New York about $100,000 in fines, fees, restitution, and child support. And yet I landed in an environment where people cared about my growth and people invested in me. And ultimately left the Legal Action Center 6 years later. I didn't plan to go to law school, and so I wanted to be in an environment where I was talking to people who were exiting the system every day, and Fortune was just the best place for that. And went there to do policy work, built the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, named after the founder, and learned from the Legal Action Center how to establish the sort of relationships it takes to move policy forward, and had a chance to peek behind the curtain and see how decisions are made that impact the very same communities that I grew up in. And as much as I appreciated the opportunity to do that sort of high-level policy work, drafting legislation, moving it forward, getting the governor to sign off, and so on, I was actually hugely dismayed at the lack of voice in those processes by the very people most impacted. At Just Leadership USA, we say people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And the reason I believe that is I find myself now in rooms with people who advise the United States Attorney General, mayors around the country, legislators around the country. And when I walk out of those rooms, people often say to me, you know, your input in there was just invaluable. And initially, in the first few years of my career, I didn't understand where that was coming from. These people are Harvard educated, Yale educated, and so on. And what they were referring to was experiential knowledge, the ability to hear people's proposals, many times well-intentioned, and sort of run it through the lens of my experience and giving them feedback on how I think that would land for individuals in the situation that I used to be in. And so throughout my career, I've made sure I've spent a lot of time listening closely to the people who are exiting prison every day, going into many, many prisons around this country to listen to the people who are most impacted, because they have solutions to their own problems. And we don't want to believe that. We dehumanize them, and we believe they don't add value. And I don't think that's true. So at Just Leadership USA, we invest in the leadership of people who serve time to be part of the solution. So rarely are they invested in, right? They face the stigma of having a criminal record. We often don't think of them as assets in the work to undo mass incarceration. At Just Leadership, we do. We actually invest in them. We have a year-long leadership training. We source people from all over the country. So our leaders now in our current cohort represent 14 states and 4 regions around the country. And they are people like myself who have served time, and their experience in the system has motivated them to want to do something to change that system.
So if someone comes out of prison, for example, and they get hooked up with Just Leadership, you guys are making an investment in their future. Specifically, how does that play out? What happens to those individuals?
Sure. So most of the people we end up identifying have been out for about 3 to 5 years. Reentry is a really tough process, even for people who are closely connected to their family and have resources. It's a very bumpy road. People are couch surfing. People are trying to figure it out. So we look for people who are 3 to 5 years out who are much more stable. They fill out an application, they get scored, ranked, interviewed, we make decisions. We bring them to New York 4 times a year. And while they're here, we bring in communications experts, fundraising experts, policy advocacy experts. We bring in leaders in the field of criminal justice reform to help widen their network. We build on their existing skills. We did some research with Columbia University, the Center for Institutional and Social Change at the law school, and we paid close attention to existing leaders to hear from them what's worked for them, what's built their capacity, what do they care about the most. So, for instance, storytelling. People who've been involved in the system have gone through a lot of trauma, and yet they've learned how to take their stories and turn their stories into powerful narratives about what could have been done differently in their lives. How could the criminal justice system have served them differently? And so we help them hone that skill to be able to not just tell their story, but tell it strategically and towards moving forward the policy reform that they hope to see happen.
African Americans represent about 12 to 13% of the American population, but fully 40% of the nation's prison population. Why are so many blacks in prison?
Yeah. In this country, we criminalize the color of a person's skin. That is clear, and it starts with policing, and it ends all the way at the end of the line with parole and probation, and who gets prison versus who gets community-based correction, and so on. Having said that, unfortunately, the research shows us that the better job we do of helping Americans understand disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on people of color, so the blacker we paint the criminal justice system, is the less white Americans want to do something about it. And that is troubling. And it means that we have to obviously tell the truth. The data shows that there's disproportionate impact. But at the same time, think about convergence of interest, right? How do you help white Americans, particularly poor white Americans, realize that this system similarly is swallowing up their children, their lives, their opportunity, and hope for a future?
I've covered a lot of this, and I then went back and looked at some of the research, and it's clear about this disproportionate treatment that you're talking about. So blacks are more likely to be jailed than whites for the same offenses. They're more likely to receive a harsher sentence. They're more likely to be arrested in the first place. African Americans get less favorable plea deals, less likely to get mental health treatment. So you've been paying such close attention to this for such a long period of time. You seem like a reasonable, even-tempered man. How do you keep from not just sort of going off into a rage? Why are you not just so angry about this?
Very outcome focused. And so I can rile against the system. People do it all day long. When I look at my social media feed, there's enough people out there reminding Americans of how this system really crushes the entire spine of communities of color, if you will. And I think that is important work, and I think that power concedes nothing without a demand. I love the folks who are doing the Black Lives Matter stuff. I think their work is hugely important. I think young folks are going to be a big part of getting us to the finish line. At the same time, I have experienced what it is to walk into the room with the decision makers in this space, and they need to hear from someone who they feel comfortable enough with to hear the message. And so I would argue that I deliver a very similar message to the folks who are rallying against the system, except I deliver it in a way that decision makers hear it. And I think that is really important. If you look at my track record of accomplishment, we've gotten a lot done by the approach we've taken. Folks who visit our website, who look at the messaging of JustLeadershipUSA, will realize that, one, we're being very visionary. Our goal is to cut the number of people under correctional supervision in the United States in half by 2030. Why? Because the field has become extremely incremental. When you're fighting against such a formidable system, it's so easy to take the wins where you can get them, the small wins. And yet, I would argue that we are at a point in this country now where the ground is fertile for reform. When you have people like John Legend putting his career on the line to say, I'm going to join this effort to end mass incarceration. Right. Steve Buscemi, an actor, just finished supporting our work at a recent benefit. You have people now who just 5-10 years ago may not have been willing to put their name and their reputation on the line. I think it's definitely a different environment. Hillary Clinton, Rand Paul, almost every presidential candidate as they're launching their initiative is saying something about criminal justice, but that has to translate into reform. And that is the goal of Just Leadership, to have that translate into structural, systemic reform, so that when we look back in 10, 20 years, we realize that we didn't just reduce the number of people in prison, but we created a criminal justice system that's fairer and more just.
Now, you've written that nearly 75% of people in local jails are there for nonviolent offenses. Talk about that. What kind of offenses are you talking about? And why are so many locked up for those offenses?
Yeah, these are offenses that weren't even considered offenses just 10, 15, 20 years ago. We have decided to use policies like stop and frisk and broken windows. And what these things do is that they net widen, right? So they turn police officers into occupying forces, and it gives them tools to target behaviors that, again, just 10 years ago wasn't considered criminal. And what happens is that once people get pulled into the system, I mean, it is a system with many, many ways in, one way through, and no way out. And so even if people come in with the most minor of charges, it is so hard to extricate yourself from that system. Some people say, well, what's the difference if you get arrested, you spend a night in jail, and you get a $100 fine? A $100 fine may as well be $1 million to a person who cannot afford $100. And then when they don't pay it, it turns into a warrant. And now the next interaction with a police officer through stop and frisk or one of these other heavy-handed policies turns into maybe resisting arrest or some other more serious charge. And then people just get pulled in further and further and further. I was in my neighborhood recently, Harlem, and one of the young guys on the corner, he just saw me walking by. He said, "Mister, I need a job." I said, well, that's not usually how people look for a job, but I'm glad you at least said something to me. And then we engaged in a conversation about why he was having such a hard time finding a job. And he talked about all of these minor arrests he's gotten over the last 7 or 8 years, many of them for hanging out in the neighborhood, nothing to do. And yet he now believes that there's just no chance for him. Like, forget about if that's true or not. Like, this young man, 28 years old, has decided that he's done, that there's no space for him in the labor market. And the truth is that he may be right based on our current policies, unfortunately.
Proponents of ever longer prison sentences, of stop and frisk, of broken windows policing, they will say, look, we've done this for a long time now and crime has gone down. Therefore, it's working. You're on the wrong side of history here. What's your response?
Well, I was at City Hall a couple of years ago with then Mayor Bloomberg. And we were having a discussion about stop and frisk. And at one point, he said, oh, come on, Glenn. He said, it's all the blacks and Latinos committing all the crime.
Whoa.
Where do you want me to send my cops? And I said, with all due respect, Mr. Mayor, I want you to send your cops where there's crime, right? Communities that are high crime want public safety, right? Like, we have this weird narrative where you say, I don't want stop and frisk, and people say, oh, so you don't want police officers.
Right.
No one's saying that. At the same time, those police officers don't have to violate people's civil rights. And that is what was happening. And so if you look at the numbers, at one point, 800,000 people were stopped and frisked. And if you look at the number of guns we got off the street, infinitesimally small.
Hardly any.
Yes. And so the mayor said to me, would you rather have those guns on the street? And I said, Mr. Mayor, I would, if you're going to violate the civil rights of hundreds of thousands of people in this city to get a couple of guns off the street, I think I may have to actually choose the latter.
And close to 90% of the people that they stopped had done absolutely nothing wrong. There's no reason to stop them. I used to really get frustrated covering those stories.
When I moved to Harlem, the police officers at the corner, when they would see me come home dressed like this, they would say, good evening, how are you? One day on the weekend, a few weekends after moving there, I was dressed in jeans and boots, and I'm driving my car, pretty nice car, and I get pulled over by the same police officer that says good evening to me when I come home. And he had his partner searching my car while I was outside the car, pressed against the car. I had my driver's license. I had my registration. There was no reason to even take me out of the car. And this is the same police officer who was treating me differently solely based on how I was dressed from one day to the other.
We've got about 30 seconds left. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the direction we're going when it comes to criminal justice reform?
I'm actually hugely optimistic. I've been doing this work long enough now to know that we're in a different space than we were before. And you know who I give much of the credit to? Young folks. I think young folks are going to bring to bear the sort of pressure and demands that we need to get policymakers 10,000 feet up to actually do something. And the question is, how much do we hold their feet to the fire and how much do we get done? But I'm hugely hopeful.
Glenn E. Martin, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. It's the shame of this city. Nearly 60,000 people are crowded into our homeless shelters every night. 25,000 of them are children. State Assemblyman Andrew Herbert said New York City is experiencing its worst crisis of homelessness since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Why is this not a big story? When you've got tens of thousands of families left with no place to stay but in a shelter, you've got a profound tragedy on your hands. In New York City, the number of families in that dismal category has increased by more than 25% over the past decade, despite our so-called economic recovery. For African American families with children, the number in homeless shelters has increased a staggering 41%. And yet, we're barely paying attention. 25,000 children will be guided into the shelters again tonight, but most New Yorkers won't even bother to notice. Shame on us. That's all for now. See you next time.